So thank you, Nora. It's quite a privilege to be presenting on this platform today. And I'll be very honest, when Nora reached out to me a few weeks ago, I was quite skeptical. I wasn't sure if my research sort of fit under the purview of this conference. But she was very quick to respond, saying that's exactly why we need you, and that mobility is not just about cars, and it's not about self-driven vehicles and fancy highways, but it's so much more than that. So that's precisely why I'm here today. My research is on vulnerable populations that we often tend to forget about or very conveniently ignore because it's not shiny, it's not glittering, it's not fancy enough when we talk about inclusive, sustainable mobility. It's basically my PhD topic. I am a first-year researcher, and this project is being funded by the Dutch Ministry and W.O. Wotro. I'm doing this under the supervision of Professor Ajay Bailey. This is quite the beginning of the research, so I do have a lot more questions than answers, so to speak, which also means I'm open to suggestions, I'm open to collaborative ideas on this topic, so happy to take up one-on-one discussions even after this, right? So just to start with, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the settings of the Global South. So I wanted to show off this picture just to give you a sense of the contextual realities that I would be referring to throughout my presentation. So this is a typical working day in Dhaka. Dhaka is the capital of Bangladesh. If you haven't been there, I urge you to visit at some point when COVID is much, way more under control, because it's insanely crazy. I don't want to get into the population statistics, but this is what it is. It's 7:30 a.m. in the morning, and this is what a regular working day in Dhaka would look like. You see mixed lane traffic, there's public buses, there's those three-wheeler paratransit we call CNGs. But the bulk of that street is flooded with pedestrians, right? And if you look closely enough, majority of these pedestrians are women on their way to work. They typically work in these garment industries, which employs roughly about 4 to 4.5 million people, of which 80% are women. And they tend to travel together in crowds and groups, sort of looking after each other's safety. So as a result, on any given workday, one would find Dhaka to be this contemporary metropolis, sort of brimming with millions of women on the move. And you'd see women riding the public bus alongside men. You'd see them riding these scooties to work. Some of them, you'd see them bargaining and haggling with grocery lenders. You'd see them dropping off children to school, escorting the elderly to the hospitals and clinics, using all modes of transport, really. And so to any outsider, the prominent visibility of women on the streets would make it seem like this mega city, grants you full access, and that women are sort of free to move anywhere at any point of time as and when they please. My argument is that this access, in quotation, is conditional. And what do I mean by that? Let me just, before I get any further, I just want to take a step back and talk a little bit about understanding mobility. Now, the beauty of this concept is that there's numerous ways of looking at mobility, right? I mean, it's such an interdisciplinary field. You've got transport geographers, you've got urban planners, you've got engineers, you've got energy specialists, you've got technical specialists, all of us looking at mobility through our own lenses. And I find it useful to sort of use this definition to ground me and remind me of the premise of my work. So I love this definition by Creswell, and which was further illustrated by Jones, that transport, or the journey from point A to point B, is like the only visible part of mobility. It's only the tip of the iceberg. And there's an entire block of ice underneath, which is all these journeys that never really made, that never really manifested into action. So there's journeys that never materialized because maybe the bus was too crowded, or you couldn't afford the trip, or the bus stop was too dark that you couldn't wait alone at night, or the bus route information was unclear, or the drivers aren't reliable. So there's this plethora of reasons, which we basically refer to as being social. It's a contention between social and spatial mobility that sort of combines to give you this overall discussion. And Jones, I think, illustrates this very well. He puts forth these three components, right? There's individual action, which we see as these journeys, but there's also the potential action, which is the journeys that people would have liked to make, but are unable to because of certain limitations. And then there's the freedom of action. So having the option to even consider making that option is still a part of mobility. And while we've studied individual action a lot, it's the last two bullets that really haven't been, it remains unaccounted for when we talk about mobility. So here's another picture. So it's called a foot over bridge, and it's basically there for pedestrians to cross the road and not hold up traffic. So with the best of intentions, and they're usually typically placed in these four-way intersections in Dhaka. As you can see, there's a long flight of stairs followed by a stretch of the bridge that helps you cross the other side, and then a flight of stairs down again. But the question is, would a pregnant woman be able to climb the stairs and cross the bridge and then down again? And even if she were, would it be ideal for her to do so? Would an older adult be able to do that? Somebody who needs assistance walking. Would someone in a wheelchair be able to do this? How about mother carrying a baby or a stroller? So the answer to all of those questions is no. And that just goes on to show that most of these mobility infrastructures that are designed are not necessarily designed for older people. They're not designed for mothers with babies. They're not designed for pregnant women. They're not designed for people with disabilities. And this picture is sad and funny at the same time, that even though it's there, you see all these people sort of crossing the road using the streets at the risk of endangering their lives. They choose to cross the street and not use the foot over bridge that's there. So the question, overall remains that what are these infrastructures really serving? Who are they serving? Who designs them? And for whom? Now, the streets are car friendly. I mean, if you discount the traffic and the time lost, sure, it's car friendly. But majority of the city's peoples, as I've shown, are pedestrians. Majority can't even afford cars. So going by the population demographic of Bangladesh, there's 50% roughly women, there's 20% who are elderly, there's 10% that are disabled. But if anything, we've come to realize that our cities aren't exactly designed with these vulnerable populations in mind, right? And the provision of transport is done without really taking into account these lives that it's designed for. They're only designed for this one commuter, which is preferably male, who is able-bodied and completely healthy. And if you see the trip pattern of mobility of these transports that are available, they're mostly designed for 9-to-5 jobs and not even for people with shifting work, right? Not somebody who belongs to the informal economy, basically. So what you leave out is people who need flexible trips. You leave out people who need to do trip chaining, that is, have shorter trips, one connected to the other. You leave out people who are traveling with babies, who are traveling with elderly people. You leave out people who work in the informal sector. And that's a huge population that's really excluded when you're designing for mobility patterns. And I also argue that not everybody who has access to the city enjoys the same level of experiences. So there's going to be varying degrees of exclusion. I may feel more included than the other woman out there. And that's due to these intersectionalities that exist, right? And there's new liberal thinkers sort of who believe that urbanization itself is sort of to blame because it tends to be this class phenomena. where the rights to make or remake the city hasn't exactly been uniform. It's been unjustly distributed. And if you were to sort of take a step back to think that in the process of encouraging, access for middle class, urban-based, car-based mobility, the system at large has ignored the needs of vulnerable and marginalized segments of the society. But it's not like the governments can get away with it, because there's been plenty of declarations and international agreements that the governments have mandates to sort of ratified agreements to abide by. The last of which was the UN Habitat 2010, where UN calls for these rights to the city framework, where all these countries have to sort of abide by the 4 pillars that are supposedly supposed to ensure inclusiveness, the economic, political, social, and cultural. It calls for freedom from harassment and violence, and including the fear of violence on the streets to ensure the safety of public spaces. So it's not like the governments can sort of get away, out of this sticky situation with a clean chit. They do have certain mandates to abide by. Now, just to go back to that previous question that I asked about conditional access, I would like to draw your attention to these 3 topics. There's transport poverty, there's time poverty, and safety. And if you think back to that garment worker women, the picture that I showed at first, most of these female garment workers don't walk to work because they enjoy walking, because they enjoy, a 45-minute walk, morning and evening walk before a 12-hour shift or after a 12-hour work shift. It's because with the little salary that they're paid, much of that goes to their children's education, the rent, the utilities, paying interest on money lenders, the out-of-pocket health expenditures. And so spending on their travel and comfort is considered a luxury, which is why they're called captive walkers. It's not a choice. They don't walk by choice. And this is exactly what I call, constrained and conditional access, that the women have access to the city, but it's not on their terms. And underpinning this outcome is this bigger theory of transport poverty, which is basically how, social disadvantages combine with transport disadvantages. And you're stuck in this systemic cycle of transport poverty. And if I could just illustrate that with an example. So if you think of that working woman who needs to be at work at 8 a.m. in the morning, for instance, and it requires her to walk an hour to work, she probably needs to wake up by 4 a.m. in the morning, run her errands, fetch water from the public sanitation or the public taps, because they typically tend to live in these slums and squatter settlements, right? It's not the best of neighborhoods. They earn very little, so they can't spend it much on their own luxuries and transport. And so they also prefer to live in these settlements, which are also prone to eviction. It's unhygienic, it's unsafe, it's more often than not, they're inaccessible to the public services like hospitals and clinics. So all of that reduces their accessibility to factor markets, for instance, accessibility to healthcare. And also they have very little education to begin with. Right, and so they're always stuck in these low-end jobs pertaining to the informal sector. So there's also it's almost a daily struggle of daily wage, and not enough income security on that end. So it's if I'm able to explain this correctly, it's almost like social disadvantage, and then there's also transport disadvantage, because they're always walking, which is always the slowest mode of transport, or the rickshaw, again the slowest. And both of that sort of contributes to that time poverty, transport poverty narrative. And it's the systemic structure that supersedes everything else. And of course, the issue of safety, I quoted 2 studies here just to give you a glimpse of how bad the situation is. So Dhaka ranks the 7th most dangerous megacity for women, according to Reuters Foundation. According to BRAC, which is the largest NGO in Dhaka and in the world, one of their studies in 2018 goes on to say that 94% of women have experienced sexual harassment while traveling in public transport. And so women tend to avoid traveling alone. They tend to avoid traveling in crowded vehicles. They avoid traveling in dark after evening. And it's not just, being a victim of sexual assault, but it's also the fear, the intrinsic fear that you carry all the time, whether or not you've been a victim, that can severely severely sort of restrict your access to these services. And while we're on the subject of public spaces and public transport, it'd be unfair if I didn't touch upon governance. Now, I'm not going to blame Bangladesh alone for this, because it's pretty much the same, in all the countries in Global South. If you look at India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, it's pretty much the same state of governance. But arguably, the issue is more socio-political than it is a matter of environment concerns. And that's because, there's these turf struggles between the private and public sector. Public transport investment it tends to focus on car-friendly infrastructure instead of building mass rapid transit for the marginalized. And the discourse is almost always hinged on state-of-the-art infrastructure and not so much on inclusivity or sustainability. Now, if you look at the organogram that I show here, it just goes on to show, it's silly, but it's also sad that there's 8 ministries and almost, roughly 20 organizations that are in charge of decisions that is directly or indirectly tied to transport. I don't need to say this, but the uneven jurisdiction across the departments, across the functions, is not even unique to Dhaka. Like I said, it's almost the same everywhere in the Global South. But the extent of confusion or the weak coordination mechanisms that exists between these departments, the gaps in accountability is quite extraordinary. And of course, the entire decision-making is pretty much dominated by men. There's very little visibility or representation of women in transport across all the layers. As such, there's very little understanding and recognition of the gravitas of sexual violence. And I say this, as a woman growing up in Bangladesh, I can share firsthand experience of how we tend to normalize the sexual objectification of women, because it's just something you grow up with. And policymakers and regulatory authorities, they all tend to trivialize it with this air of dismissal almost, because there's so many other burning issues that needs to be taken care of. There's dowry deaths to look into, there's child marriage to look into. So sexual assault is almost at the bottom rung of that ladder, and it's not taken seriously enough. This is, it's a conceptual model that I use to just, It's a conceptual model that I use to just illustrate all the theories that I've been saying so far. If you look at the 3 cogwheels on the left, you'll see the micro refers to the individual circumstances, so the social disadvantage that I was talking about. The meso cogwheel is more about the social norms and practices at the community levels, the invisible power relations that you toy around with. And the macro is, of course, the institutional and more larger picture, the governance issues and all of that. So it's these 3 cogwheels that we use in a heuristic manner to sort of help us understand how who gets excluded, how they get excluded, and the varied forms and the influences of each other on social exclusion, which basically suggests that there's no single factor that explains why some women may feel more excluded than others. I'm not going to get into the theories, but the last thing I do want to, I don't want to leave you with this grim picture that I've painted. And I feel like despite the narrative of danger that persists, of course, it's like I said, you see the city full of women on the move. And so you question how, if the state is really such, in such dark state, how is it that women continue to navigate the streets of Dhaka? And I think that's where the magic happens. Women on a daily basis continue to court risks and assert themselves in situations that are plagued or rather riddled with these considerations of safety, respectability, modesty, convenience, and continue to sort of seize their own destinies. And their assertion of agency in, sometimes very openly, sometimes not so openly, at times opportunistic, at times, rebellious, but this continuous assertion of agency in subtle ways continue to sort of push that envelope. And so it's a constant state of negotiation that happens with the state, informing and reforming the zones of safety, which goes on to obviously ensure their facilitation and access to the affairs. So I just want to leave you all with some food for thought. I hope that at the end of my research, I'm able to sort of shed a clearer light on a lot of these questions. That we hope to sort of better understand the gender relationships to public space, women's construction of safety and mobility, and what it takes for them to reclaim inclusion in a city that wasn't exactly designed, to support it. It'd be interesting to look at what role these bigger institutions have to play, like media, governance, policy, and for instance, is offering public transport exclusively for women the solution? Is that the good way forward? Yes, it may solve the issue of harassment inside the vehicle for quite some time, but it is a band-aid solution. It doesn't necessarily ensure first mile and last mile connectivity and safety in that way. I know Delhi, for instance, has introduced this ladies' coach or a woman's coach, which has allowed women to access the Delhi metro on their own terms in terms of safety. But if you sort of stop to think about it, that sort of gives you that impression of an implicit maleness of public space. It's as if it's only the ladies' coach that's for women, but all other coaches are for men. And that's definitely not the messaging we want to give out, right? So there's been, like Stephanie, the speaker before me mentioned, there's a lot that's been done in terms of intervention over the last decade. But it remains to be seen how much of it has been effective. It remains to be quantified. It remains to be really compared on the same scale, because it's not one magic bullet that can solve all these issues. It requires a lot of collaboration between the private and public sector to come together on certain ideas. It's as if we're trying to solve these 19th century problems with 21st century tools. So, of course, technology has a role to play. So are we using it, for long-term sustainability? There's been a boom of apps in the last few years that allow you to sort of report, unsafe situations or emergency apps on your phone, these panic buttons. But again, the criticism against that is that a lot of these times, the only purpose they serve is to sort of act as digital chaperones, and they're not solving the larger issue at hand. So yeah, I just want to leave off with this. This is my research topic, and these are some of the methods that we'd be employing over the next few years. I'd be doing life histories, in-depth narratives, obviously. We'll be doing a lot of GIS data mapping and geonarratives with the target group, a lot of participatory photo voice narratives that we want to do. And of course, I think media has a big role to play, so I'll be looking into that too. Yeah, happy to discuss further. Thank you. I hope I've done justice to the topic. Thank you, Nora.